Hello everyone, my name is Chucky Prophet, and welcome to the beginning of my retrospective into a series I'm guessing you've likely heard of, called Attack on Titan. Now, what made me want to do this retrospective is essentially the fact that Attack on Titan is a very interesting case to me of a show that seems to have gotten popular almost overnight, and maintained that popularity even over a long 4-year break. But over time, perceptions of the show have changed and become a lot more split, and the reasons for that split, and specifically how people began to criticize the show as supporting overtly nationalist, militaristic, and fascist themes, are of great interest to me, because, to me, Attack on Titan couldn't be further from that, and that's a theme that we'll continue to examine as I go into the different parts of Attack on Titan. But for now, I want to look at the rise of Attack on Titan. How the show got people invested to begin with, whether or not Season 1 was actually that good in retrospect, and what interesting little seeds did Isayama and the creative team behind Season 1 leave to build onto stuff going forward. Now, I actually found this very interesting because I hadn't seen Attack on Titan Season 1 in a very long time prior to making this video, and going back to it was actually incredibly surprising on how good it was. I'd previously, even when I was going back to rewatch the show, completely ignored Season 1, thinking, well, I already know what happens in it, and I don't really like it that much anyway. But I don't think I would make that mistake again, because Season 1 is actually very good for reasons that I'll get into. I don't intend this to be a kind of practical retrospective in terms of, these were the key players, this is when Isayama began running it. That's not what I want this to be. Essentially, I'm going to be looking at it from more of a pure perspective of what is going on within the show itself, with a little bit of context towards the manga and other important things when necessary, but I'm not really majorly going to be looking at the practical aspects of the show itself, if that makes sense. What I am interested in, however, is how people watched it, how the structure of Season 1 and then the subsequent 4-year wait afterwards for the next season shaped people's expectations of the show going forward. Now, without any further ado, let's get going. I think it's fair to attribute the main appeal of Attack on Titan to 3 key factors. Number 1, it's a zombie show. At the time Attack on Titan was coming out, zombie shows were generally a giant hit. You had The Walking Dead consistently hitting millions of ratings and being the most popular show on TV by a metric mile. Generally, it was the right era for shows and anime coming out that would focus on the idea of a small group of survivors surviving the apocalypse against a great threat. And in this case, that threat is the Titans. Now, what separates the Titans from your ordinary zombie is their sheer size and power. There are strategies that would allow a single person to overcome a zombie that just won't work against a Titan, because they have an overwhelming physical presence that a human can't overcome by themselves. They're capable of literally ripping buildings to shreds. And I think this is an extra layer of fear on top of an already terrifying concept that made them instantly iconic. You inherently want to see how people are going to be able to resist and fight back against these creatures, and that's where the second major appeal comes in, the ODM gear. It's this unique advantage developed by humanity that allows them to fight the Titans on equal ground, using speed and maneuverability to overcome sheer size and power. And this is automatically interesting to a viewer. It plays into our desire to see the underdog take down the Titans David versus Goliath style. Finally, there's obviously a little bit more to Attack on Titan than the binary aspects of being terrified of the Titans and wanting to see humanity succeed. There's also the continuously evolving mystery of Attack on Titan's world, which is really naturally and excellently built up over time. You get small little hints constantly building towards a greater truth, and the world keeps expanding in interesting ways in front of you, unexpectedly. And rather than constantly setting up this big mystery and then going, there's an even bigger mystery, the central mystery of Attack on Titan is clear from the beginning, and it's one that's incredibly interesting to the viewer, understanding how the Titans got here and what the world outside the walls is even like. It's the benefit of having such an isolated setting. I think these are definitely the three main aspects that drew people to the series en masse originally. Next, in a note on presentation, the animation is sincerely gorgeous. Wit cooked ungodly hard here. Whether it's an emotional, quiet moment being beautifully rendered and animated, or whether it's the gorgeous choreography of the fight scenes showcasing the maneuverability of the ODM gear and allowing for this great variety in fights. There are a very few small dips in animation quality, but they're never really noticeable enough for you to go, that looks horrible. They're mostly just sort of in the background, and even though they are there, they do pave the way for much, much prettier things to come in where needed. I think the most obvious examples of this typically tend to come in with Trost, but they're present throughout the whole show. They also have this really interesting and unique combination of 3D backgrounds and 2D animation, which allows for the fight scenes especially to have this kind of beautiful sense of flow and establishing of the environment. You understand everything's position in relation to each other, and it allows the ODM gear to be fully as maneuverable as it needs to be. Again, in a small note on music, it doesn't really need to be said, but Hiroyuki Sawano is just kind of the GOAT. And every single track on this OST absolutely bangs. It's used generally pretty well. I think there's a couple of instances where a song might feel out of place, but again, nothing to really write home about. Anyway, with that kind of preamble about presentation and the general appeals of the series out of the way, let's get talking. Now, I'm going to begin by saying that I'm going to aim to go through each episode of Attack on Titan individually, giving a brief summary of it, talking about the most important points of the episode thematically, and in terms of what it does for Attack on Titan as a greater story, and give a little bit of a strengths and weaknesses on them. As well as talking about the structure of the arcs overall. So, it all begins on April the 7th, 2013, with To You in 2000 Years airing, the first episode. This little mini arc of 2 episodes, the opening arc of Attack on Titan, is called The Fall of Shiganshina. And in many ways, for me, this is kind of the gold standard for a starting arc. It introduces the 3 major appeals of Attack on Titan, the mystery, the ODM gear, and the Titans themselves, and does this neatly and compactly while expanding on the overall points of interest in the series going forward, like who is the Colossal Titan, who is the Armored Titan, what's in Eren's dad's basement. All very central questions that the series will focus on going forward. Now, episode 1, To You in 2000 Years, is again very much a deservedly held gold standard for opening episodes. It's precise, shocking, and there's actually a lot of thematic depth to even the bits that happen in the quiet kind of establishing period where we're establishing our main characters and the setting that we're in. So the episode opens by introducing us to Season 1's main theme, freedom. Armin gives us this monologue about humans being livestock, trapped in this pen that we cannot escape, and effectively the Colossal Titan is just the thing that breached the pen. Followed by this triumphant fight scene of the Scout Squad encountering a Titan and deciding to hunt and engage with it. And we cut off before anything really happens, but there's this general sense of triumphant resolve to that scene, which is central to characterizing the Scouts in general, but that will be played upon to make later scenes in this same episode even more effective. After this, we get introduced to two of our main characters, Eren and Mikasa, after they wake up after cutting a load of wood. Now, there is a little bit of a flash-forward jump scare that doesn't really mean all that much, and it's just kind of interesting setting up plot hooks for later. It does kind of start the episode with an interesting air of mystery, but really the most important opening event in the episode doesn't happen until Eren's conversation with Hannes. In this conversation, Eren essentially berates Hannes for being a soldier who doesn't do his job, who doesn't man the wall, who doesn't take the threat of the Titans seriously. Hannes responds effectively by saying, "If I'm a coward for enjoying the peace that we're enjoying, I'm fine with being a coward." Now, this is a very interesting use of dramatic irony here, as we know, from our perspective, that the Titans will eventually attack, as the opening of this episode shows. And so it's easy to very much fall in line with Eren's line of thinking here. Eren believes that what really needs to happen is for humanity to preemptively attack the Titans, to begin this sort of glorious crusade of reclamation, of reclaiming the outside world for humanity. And he takes out his anger and frustration on the fact that humanity isn't currently doing that on random people who have very little to do with whether or not it's actually happening. Now, it is somewhat valid for Eren to criticize Hannes' decisions here, but if you think about it in a grander sense, especially with ideas that this episode and the upcoming season in general will explore, Eren puts a lot more value on this dream of a glorious reclamation of humanity's territory than he does on human life, which is a trait that right now is seen as just harmless idealism. But when his character takes a serious dark turn in Season 4, that idealism becomes something else entirely, and leads him directly to taking a lot of the actions that he takes. So, I guess the fundamental question there is, does the story itself and the author consider Eren to be in the right? Well, let's see, shall we? This idea of Eren's glorious war to reclaim the areas outside the wall, and the triumphant image we have of the Scouts before, is shattered when the Scouts return through the wall and we see them bloody, beaten, and battered, with most of them having taken some form of major injury, and a vast chunk of them now dead. Now, this is excellent because it shows the physical reality and cost of war, and this is something that the series continually reminds us, even in moments of great triumph for humanity. Even when the characters of Attack on Titan make a great stride forwards towards defeating the Titans, it never forgets the cost that is incurred by making those actions, and that fundamentally is a big part of what, for me, doesn't make it this sort of piece of pro-war propaganda. This scene actually has this pretty solid exchange where a grieving mother comes up to the Scout regiment and begs to know where her son is, and all they have to give her is an arm to bury. And she breaks down and begs and wants to know why this had to happen and whether or not her son truly died for the greater good of humanity. And it turns out he doesn't. The Scouts made no great stride towards reclaiming the area outside the wall, and his sacrifice was effectively meaningless. Again, Attack on Titan reminds us here that death in war isn't immediately glorious just because it happens in a war, and shows us the material reality of those that die and those that are left behind. However, as good as this scene is in a structural sense, it does have a bit of a problem with the way that it's directed, at least for me. See, one of the main criticisms of Season 1 of Attack on Titan is the kind of melodrama of it all. And this is partially because a lot of people start dying very quickly when you have little to no attachment to them, and also because of interactions like this. The way that director Tetsuro Araki, the mastermind behind the iconic potato chip scene in Death Note, tends to direct is this way of transforming the ordinary into the unordinary by using constant quick pace and rising swells of music to pump you up, even when it's not something you should really be pumped up over. Now, this works really well in the potato chip scene, for reasons that I don't want to get into because that will become its own tirade, but suffice it to say, this style can work really well for the intended purpose of a scene. However, it's not right here. When these characters enter into what is effectively a screaming match, it just completely throws the entire somber tone of the scene off. Continuing on, we have another little interesting piece of dramatic irony being played with. There are these group of citizens who are accosting the scouts and criticizing the scout regiment for going out and getting hundreds of people killed for little to no actual gain. Now, because we are looking at the story from Eren's perspective, it becomes very easy here to hate these people. You know, we know that the scouts are actually in the right. We know that the scouts will eventually become the heroes. We know that the Titans are going to attack, but it's central to remember that the characters do not know this. And as of the context of this situation, if you think about it from their perspective, they're kind of completely in the right. There's this military organization which is funded with their money, the little amount of money they do have as people in the exterior of the walls, and essentially they're just going out and getting hundreds of people killed with no gain. So yeah, it's completely logical to be upset. And the interesting thing is, even after seeing all of this, after hearing all of this valid criticism, Eren still wants to be a member of the Scouts, and this is central to understanding his character. And at the beginning it's interesting, because you kind of take this for granted. You kind of take it almost as a trope of the character that, yeah, he's the protagonist, so of course he's going to be this way. Of course he's going to be over-enthusiastic about joining the Scouts because that's simply what he wants to do and that's his goal. But it's interesting when it's reframed in context of how other people choose to join the Scouts. How most of the people in this world aren't like Eren. They don't see the Scouts as these glorious champions of humanity. They see it effectively as a death sentence. Sometimes a death sentence that's for the greater good, but oftentimes not. And that's really interesting to me in terms of how Eren's character is actually framed. The more you go on, the more you realize that Eren's just a little bit of a psychopath, to be honest, and he very clearly values progress towards what he considers to be freedom above human life, above his own life even. There are obviously a little bit of... Now, there is nuance to this. Eren is not a complete suicidal maniac with absolutely nothing else to him whatsoever. There are complexities to his character that are revealed later on, but this is the core of who Eren is. He values progress above individual life, including his own. When Eren returns home, this is thrown into sharp relief again. We get a bit more of this opposition from Eren's perspective that is completely justified in context, when Eren's mother berates him for wanting to join the Scout Regiment and saying that he should want to do more with his life. Now, more than that, this scene is interesting because this is where most of the major plot hooks are actually layered in, with Grisha revealing the key. And I'd just like to note a really small, lovely detail, where Eren brings up the Scout Regiment and mentions his philosophy on life, and there's this really interesting expression shift with Grisha, which is masked by this kind of flash in his glasses. And obviously, if you've watched the entire show, that this is likely the moment that he's recognizing what's going to happen from here. Moving on from this scene, we get the introduction of the third major protagonist, Armin. Armin's introduction is kind of poor in my opinion. I think the story tends to try hard a lot on making sure you know he's the smart one, and it does this a lot by having characters sort of reaffirm that he's smart. Don't get me wrong, there are moments in the story where Armin accurately shows that he is intelligent, but this is just going to become a problem I feel in this season with his characterization, where Armin constantly has to be reaffirmed to be the smartest guy in the room over and over and over again. Although it's fine enough in this scene because this does just sound like dumb shit a nerdy kid would say. After that we get a little scene of these characters all sat down discussing the outside world, and it gives a little bit of interesting perspective into the roles each of these three play in their friend group, but that's something I'd like to get into a bit more later. Because immediately after this we have the intro of the Colossal Titan. It's so incredibly iconic that it's difficult to talk about critically at this point, but suffice it to say it is incredibly well done. And to talk about the Colossal Titan itself for a moment, the animation of the Colossal Titan is extremely unique and interesting because it presents it as effectively lumbering around awkwardly. There's no grace or gravitas to it when you actually look at how it moves. It's desperately clinging onto the wall, more to prop it up than to be able to lean over fully. I think this interestingly adds another layer of menace to it, because it truly exemplifies the weight and power of this creature that it can barely even control its own body with how much sheer mass and power it's bringing behind the kick that brings down the walls. The ensuing chaos is beautifully melodramatically directed, with the Titans making it through into the interior of the wall and beginning their mass slaughter. A particular bit I'm a really big fan of is when Aaron's running back through the town towards his house, repeatedly assuring himself that everything will be fine, it has to be fine, and he turns around the corner and a giant rock has landed on his house. That's gut-wrenching. Even if you already know the story going in, it's just a really well put together small scene that gets you in Aaron's head and humanizes him quite a bit, actually. The scene of Aaron trying to save his mother but failing is one of his most critical moments, and it is essential to understanding who he becomes later. His powerlessness in front of something that he couldn't prevent becomes a running theme, which leads him to take everything into his own hands and believe he has to make everything his responsibility, which is what causes him to become drunk with power when he unlocks the Founding Titan. This is an example of a scene where the heightened melodrama of Tetsuro Araki's style is really put to good use, as the constant tense shouting match with the rising music in the background actually prevents you from even having a second to breathe in this situation, and you just kind of get gut punched repeatedly. The part where Harness shows up and we think we're going to get a triumphant recreation of what we saw in the opening, that maybe things will be okay as he swings into action, but then, and this is really, really important to establishing the fear of the Titans, he stops dead in his tracks and looks up at it, kind of glowering down at him with this malevolent smile. And that immediately instills the fear of the Titans in the audience, and why these creatures are so terrifying. It's their sheer unassailable power. The fact that, yeah, you might be able to take them down, but it requires getting close. And getting close means that it's only one swipe of a hand before you're just a spatter on a building. It's also the touch paper that lights one of the most interesting small arcs in the series for me. After this event, Harness hates himself and becomes more of a soldier to reflect the fact that he thought he was a coward in this scene. All Harness can do is sling the two kids over his back and run away as Eren's mum is eaten in front of them all, and this eats away at him in a similar way that it eats away at Eren. He's incapable of reconciling the fact that he was completely unable to do anything at this situation other than simply run. He blames himself for Carla's death, and he blames himself for being unable to do anything in that moment. And I think this is really, really important to the themes of Attack on Titan. The idea of someone's self-worth spiraling downwards out of control after they feel that they were unable to stop something that was completely within their power, when of course it wasn't. in their power remotely to stop, but that doesn't stop this endless spiral of self-hatred anyways. It's this self-hatred that leads Hannes to become what he believes to be a model soldier, and eventually sacrifice his own life attempting to save Eren. And it's also this same self-hatred that will lead later to Eren committing his genocide against the Malians. Episode 1, generally speaking, is really solid, and although I have a few problems with some directorial decisions here and there, it's incredibly good at setting up the main ideas that the series will go with going forward. Episode 2 in general is surprisingly a real banger that I didn't remember much from, but it's really interesting. It largely zooms out of Eren and Mikasa's story and focuses on the wider implications of the attack as a whole, like the effects of famine on the displaced populace. You do get one insanely good scene with Hannes, the moment he fully becomes a soldier and hates himself for being too cowardly to save Carla, a choice which sets him on the path to his own death, as well as some genuinely good moments with the trio as friends. This is the bedrock that a lot of the later events in the season will be relying on, to make you feel for these characters. Eren is this idealistic dreamer who needs Mikasa to ground him and make him remember the situation he's in, and Armin to have him second guess his decisions. They are all balanced out in their strengths and weaknesses by each other. The best parts of this episode are the small details, like the soldiers that have grown so used to not fighting, they don't even consider the possibility that their ODM gear can get over the wall after the gate closes. The abject melodrama of Attack on Titan's directorial style is put to brilliant use here, as we're shown snippets of an argument between Hannes and a group of other officers, deciding whether or not they should close the wall gate off and prevent the other Titans from breaching. Hannes believes that the gate should remain open for as long as possible to allow as many civilians to make it through, but the other commanders, panicked by the sheer unexpected danger of the situation and the danger to their own lives, decide to close the gate prematurely, before any Titans have even reached it. The tension is heightened by this effectively evolving into a screaming match between Hannes and the rest of the garrison corps stationed there, proving that these directorial choices can work if used in the right context. The entrance of the Armored Titan is unbelievably peak. It's portrayed as this unstoppable engine of destruction that just barrels through everything in its path and nothing can stop it. Shame it never will be again though. The animation here is utterly stunning, and these two threats are so iconic that finding out their identity became one of the most interesting plot hooks of early Attack on Titan. Now, as good as I think episode 2 is, there are a few faults. The random cut to Grisha injecting Eren feels very out of place. It is purposeful because it's showing us that something has happened to Eren past this point, but it would fit in much better with the high melodrama first part of the episode, but it happens just as the episode is relaxing down into a more steady, informational pace, and feels extremely jarring when it's put here. The information is also delivered in this very short and jarring way that's meant to make you interested in what goes on, and it achieves that, don't get me wrong, but again, I feel that this information is a little bit shoved in haphazardly, and would have been better retroactively shown when Eren awakens his Titan for the first time. However, despite that very minor critique, Attack on Titan does really well to avoid something that I call the episode 2 problem, where a series has this massive change in the status quo, like the Titans breaking through the walls in the first episode, and has to reintroduce us to the situation and characters after this change in the status quo, as they currently stand. I think episode 2 nimbly steps around this with a strong command of its own tone, using slower exposition to mediate you through to the current setting. So you don't get this kind of jarring cut midway through saying 4 years later, here's Eren as a scout. You get Armin delivering this devastating monologue about how the government of the interior of the walls did something even worse than what the Titans did in the initial incursion in terms of loss of life, and just sent hundreds and thousands effectively out to die, just to prevent the effects of famine from reaching those in the interior. It's this stark moment of cold, calculating, heartless sacrifice that again is never presented as a good thing. It's just this horrible decision that from a certain perspective did have to be made, but the fact that it doesn't come whatsoever at the expense of the rich elite in the interior shows Attack on Titan's true attitude to that sort of government. Once again, we are beating the fascism allegations. Again, I do think episode 2 is utterly fantastic, and honestly I think it's better than episode 1 for quite a few reasons. Sadly though, the strong place that episode 2 leads us off on will be somewhat spoiled by the next arc. The Training Corps arc is the first point of major divergence between the anime and the manga. I like it better in the manga because the manga takes us straight to the eve of the Battle of Trost, which flows much better and avoids the lull in pacing that can be found in this arc in the anime. Momentum is incredibly important for shows like Attack on Titan, and the Training Corps arc really just slows it all down to a halt. Episode 3 begins with like a Full Metal Jacket style drill instructor scene, as Stohess goes through all the recruits and begins to sort of break them down, which serves two purposes. Number one, it's introducing us to all the new characters that the training arc will be introducing, like Connie, Jean, Sasha, etc. And it's giving us a little bit of extra explicit anti-war theming, because the acknowledged point of using the drill instructor in the show is to break down the recruits as much as possible, so they become tools of war rather than vulnerable people. And it's going okay, until there's this awkward break into humor. It's obviously subjective, because obviously humor is subjective, but I generally just don't find a lot of the Sasha stuff that funny. I know I'm gonna get shot several times in the head for that, but I don't know. I'm not that big of a fan of her character until she gets development in season 2, and I just don't think she works that well as a gag. I don't think AOT really needed a gag character, and it definitely feels off-kilter in this scene, which is, I think, structurally supposed to feel a lot more serious. I think it's a general problem with this arc. It's trying to show the process of the cadets being broken down into true good soldiers, but also wants to endear you to these characters at the same time, and never quite finds the right balance. It ends off with them feeling like the exact same people as they did when they walked in, which in that case, what was the point of having the drill instructor at all? I gotta say, so many of these characters are really poorly introduced in this episode. Relatively unimportant characters like Connie are given the lion's share of the focus over much more important later characters like Ymir, Annie, Krista, or even Reiner and Bertolt. That said, I really do like Jean. I didn't expect to come back in the series and magically become a Jean fan, but I did. I actually really like the fact that despite early on being presented as a little bit of a cowardly douche who just wants to join the military police so he can get a cushy position, again, within context it makes total sense for someone in this world to feel this way. That said, even though I did just say I don't like the humor, some of it does work when the jokes are well constructed and the character is more than a joke. Specifically, a lot of the funny stuff with Jean I find works well, because he's a genuine character with genuine ideas to bring to the series, on top of having funny jokes. Episode 3's central conflict is the aptitude test, a plot point that effectively has Eren go into this ODM gear rig setup, and he fails immediately. Now, this of course is a giant red flag moment, because it means that if he fails at the ODM gear, he can't become a soldier and join the scout regiment. Now, there are interesting ideas that this could bring to the table. It would be interesting if Eren actually struggled with the aptitude tests, and had to learn how to overcome his difficulty. Imperfections in a character like this, especially when it comes to achieving their long-held goal, are really interesting sources of drama and conflict. But instead, it's just a plot hook set for later to do with Keith sabotaging his gear, which is fine, I guess, but it ruins a lot of that interesting character drama of Eren initially being bad at something, but having to work on it over time, and takes a lot of the investment out of this episode for me, because I kind of think, well, what's the point? There are some cool details in this episode, though. Things like the steam coming off of Eren's head after he gets injured, and the camera slowly panning over to Rhino when the Armored Titan is mentioned, are really fucking cool. I like the stuff with Reiner and Bertolt, even if it is just kind of stating character motivations with this weird trip to the lake for some reason. It's fun to see the foreshadowing with Reiner actually talking about returning to his stolen home. Now, a lot of my problems with episode 3 are exacerbated by the fact that episode 4 just kind of does everything 3 does, but better. It introduces us to characters, their core traits, and the new state of the setting. Cutting 3 and continuing with 4, with maybe a bit of content changed around, would have been a much better compromise for the series in general, I think. It establishes Eren and Jean's conflict, and establishes Reiner and Bertolt just as we got in 3. So 3 feels really pointless and doesn't really contribute much to the intended purpose of this arc, plus not having many Sasha scenes in 4 really does help me. 4 also adds more world building by introducing the 3 main regiments and their roles. The Garrison Regiment, which watches over the walls, the Scout Regiment, which goes beyond the walls, and the MPs, who protect the interior. It also does important character work, building up to the friendship of the main 3, which future arcs will absolutely hinge on. There's really good moments here, like Eren's impassioned speech to all the cadets about why they should join the Scout Regiment, why they shouldn't be content with just being trapped in these walls. Then the final scene of 4 is the absolutely necessary, I'm sure everything will go great this time, and we'll beat the Colossal Titan, because we're totally different to how we were 4 years ago, before everything goes to absolute shit. We also reintroduce Hannes and see the beginning of his progression into a true soldier. The episode ending just on the cusp of the oh shit moment, with the Colossal Titan showing up and Eren beginning to engage it, is a beautiful cliffhanger, by the way. I cannot imagine trying to watch this weekly without absolutely losing my mind. Overall, this arc is okay. It's very much falling into that episode 2 trap I was talking about before, where in order to re-establish the status quo, everything kind of grinds down to a halt, and we're constantly re-establishing character motivations without making anything meaningful in the way of plot progression. And I think that is a little bit of a shame, but it is really the only major dip in Attack on Titan, bar one episode coming up, which, boy, don't you worry, we'll get into. Now, before I get into unpacking the giant arc of Trost, I'd like to take a moment to talk about one of the biggest criticisms of early Attack on Titan, which I've already mentioned. A lot of people, myself included, complain about the early deaths of characters like fucking Mina Carolina feeling far too dramatic for how little we cared about them. Episodes 3 and 4 introduce a shitload of characters, many of which die very early in Trost or midway through. Some done better than others. There's a lot of chaff deaths, people thrown into the meat grinder to show the power of the Titans, used to create emotional scenes without sacrificing any of the main cast. This doesn't work terribly well because of the investment in these characters being so minimal at this point that their deaths don't have the desired impact, so some fairly well constructed scenes just lack that important punch. And this is precisely why the manga version didn't try and put all that emphasis on the cadets, because those scenes aren't going to hit hard. You physically don't have the time to build up all of the cast of these characters and make those deaths hurt. So the chaff deaths work much better as a kind of throwaway, you don't know who this is but this person's dead, and then coming back to them later and seeing them while they're alive, that delivers a little bit more of a gut punch than it does the other way around. Granted, not much more, but it enables Attack on Titan a bit more leeway with its presentation, and I think this is one of the major areas in which the manga is superior. It is a bit cheap to throw all these characters into the meat grinder all in all, but I absolutely get why they do it. Remember, as I said before, Attack on Titan always wants to remind us of the human cost of war. It never wants to kind of go, well, look at this battle, it's awfully glorious, isn't it? It always wants to remind us of the real people who die in these wars, and you might never get to know them. Here, these deaths are being used to balance out the character economy of Attack on Titan. Character economy I would define as essentially how well the story is able to balance attention between its characters, whether or not it keeps them alive to do interesting things with the story and themes through their existence, or kills them off to have this big, poignant, meaningful scene that adds to the themes of the story through that. Now, specifically, Attack on Titan will have a large problem with character economy much later in the series, and we will get back to that, but for now, character economy generally in Season 1 is really strong. Characters are introduced and then killed off where they can be used better to further other characters through their death. For example, Marco is a character that could have done interesting things later on in Attack on Titan, but his sudden and somewhat unexpected death means that Jean is forced into a really interesting place as a character, and grows very interestingly. Character economy is generally a strong point of praise I have for Trost, and the other arcs in Season 1 in general. Originally, when I started work on this video, I said to a friend that Trost would be the real rough spot of this, before getting to the actual good bits of AOT. And honestly, I was completely wrong. This arc has a lot to offer, even if it is still very flawed. The opening scene of Trost establishes the true scale of the threat of the Colossal. It has intelligence and sheer crushing strength that makes it a deadly threat to go up against, and it's a beautifully animated sequence. And you think there's going to be this kind of triumphant fight scene between the Colossal and Eren, but then it just disappears in this puff of smoke, and that's devastating. I love how it shows how fatally underprepared the forces of the wall still are, using barely effective cannon fire, which only slows the Titans down a little bit. Now, skipping a bit ahead from that, we get the introduction to Pixis. Pixis is one of my favourite characters in Attack on Titan, and I think a big part of that is down to his introduction. It tells us everything we need to know about him, while introducing another interesting aspect of the world, which is the attitudes of the aristocracy. You get this fat, bloated nobleman who berates Pixis for not being able to win this game of chess against him when Pixis is very clearly deliberately losing. And that's really important for understanding Pixis' character. Pixis believes that losing here is for the greater good, keeping this Farron on side even if it's extremely unpleasant to do so. And he does it without even a crack in his facade. This idea of personal and greater sacrifice for the greater good is a really important aspect of Pixis' character and of Trost as a whole. In order to win, we need to be able to sacrifice. This is also the first episode to really crack down on the horrors of the army, which immediately resorts to using corporal punishment as a method to maintain loyalty, which breaks the soldiers' spirits even more. These are very clearly people who are not inspired to fight, they're just forced into a situation where it's either die by Titan or die by shot on the firing line. Now, there is an interesting break for a segment of lore here, which is a bit clumsily placed and heavily expository, and feels like it's a kind of holdover from the manga. See, in the manga, this segment talking about the Titans' regeneration and their place in the ecology of the greater world is important because we have very little information about the Titans and very little time to give that information. Now, here, it's placed in the same area, but we've had the whole of episode 3 and 4 where this scene could have been placed where it wasn't breaking up the flow of events and would have been a lot more interesting and actually made particularly episode 3, better as a result. That said though, episode 5 is generally pretty good. It's a strong start to Trost, introduces the main themes of the arc, introducing its principal characters like Pixis, so they don't just randomly show up later on, and gives us our first big spate of deaths as we see, oh no, Mina Carolina drops dead. The quote-unquote death of Eren at the end of episode 5 is an interesting one. Obviously we know now that there was no real threat here, but back when this season first released, this was an absolute masterstroke, because even though you thought he probably lived somehow, you could also realistically believe he was completely dead. And with the weight of the development in the following episodes being placed on supporting leads like Mikasa, it felt a lot more real that Eren had just died here. Speaking of, episode 6, The World the Girls Saw. It's all about Mikasa, effectively, as it's just a backstory episode. Not great, but not the worst. Definitely felt a bit dragged out even when I first watched. It's connected to these ideas about living is fighting, that the first season is concerned with, and it communicates those themes well, even if Mikasa's backstory is a little bit on the melodramatic side. I love that it does just establish that Eren is a fucking psychopath though, and expands on his mental state as he views his enemies as animals in human skin. And don't get me wrong, the murderers in Mikasa's backstory are absolute scum, but it just shows us how easily Eren is able to cross that line. And by the same token, it shows us how he puts himself on the line recklessly to save his loved one. Perfect demonstration of his character. There are also some really neat little cuts and details in this episode, like the little trick it pulls with who enters the house in the Mikasa backstory, where the door knocks and we see Grisha immediately open the door after the time jump. That's just a really nice little directorial trick that makes the episode more interesting to watch. Again, episode 6 isn't exactly my favourite, but it is well put together in the grand scheme of things. Now, moving on to episode 7, which I think actually kind of crystallizes and makes a lot of episode 6's ideas even better. Now this is going to seem like a very strange segue, but the first season of Attack on Titan reminds me a lot of World War I, and I think that's part of what Isayama was trying to evoke. There is this constant theme of completely incompetent officers making terrible decisions that cost significant lives. And that's what we get a little bit of here, where we see Vormund refuse to stay and support the resupply depot, which is eventually what leads to it being overrun by the Titans. I think some scenes in this episode are a little ham-handed. Like the guy shooting himself and the sequence of Jean watching all the people die, it's just kind of a confusing mess of cuts, which is definitely a directorial issue. Those events are fine enough structurally. I mean, the guy shooting himself shows the tension of the situation that they're all in, and Jean's scene is really good apart from that, but they are small flaws that mar the episode a little bit for me. I think this episode gives us the start of pretty good arcs for Jean and Connie too, especially Jean kind of accepting his role more as a leader who understands the needs of the people. Once again, I love the small details with the Marley traitors where the camera kind of pans to them in moments where they're discussing the armored or colossal titans. Mikasa's speech and subsequent blitz charge through the Titans after discovering Eren's death is really fun and beautifully directed. Honestly, I'm coming to be much more of a Mikasa appreciator on a rewatch. I really like her arc throughout this episode. We established in episode 6 that she found her purpose in life through Eren, and it was defined by her love for him. But then she continues living to keep his memory alive. Really cool foreshadowing and a genuinely good character moment. Then, the scene where she's about to accept her death at the hands of a Titan specifically is just so cool. The fact that she sat there watching the Titan round the corner, seemingly completely without hope, and it keeps cutting to this pomegranate on the ground, commonly a symbol of death, a pomegranate being the fruit of the underworld that Persephone ate, which effectively forced her to become queen of the underworld. Symbolism for death and accepting death, and that's just such a cool detail to place in this scene. And just generally, even without that cool pomegranate symbolism, it's such a just excellent piece of characterization for Mikasa that even when she believes she has nothing left, she continues to keep fighting. Good lord. The Attack Titan's first appearance is sick. The sheer weight behind its punches and choreography beautifully communicates the fun of fighting in a giant flesh mecha. It's so good, and this, I would say, is the fourth major appeal of Attack on Titan. Once you get to this episode and you realize, holy shit, the Titans are going to start fighting each other, that is another major hook that keeps you into this series. Episode 8 is another pretty solid episode. It rounds us off at the reveal that pretty much shakes the entire foundation of the series, when Eren is revealed to be the one inside the Attack Titan. Now, to begin with, I do like the little moment of Mikasa uplifting Armin, even though he's definitely come off as more than a little whiny in the past few episodes. Again, episode 8 continues this trend of adding a lot more depth for Jean, a man who's a good leader because he can empathize with those around him, and again, this is what Attack on Titan, they prize empathy even in situations of great stress. Yes, Jean has to sacrifice people to make progress, but fundamentally he does not forget those sacrifices, and those sacrifices are not made glorious because they exist. They're still tragic and Jean still feels them. Whereas Eren only feels the sacrifices made towards getting his goals if they are someone who he directly knows. I love the scene when they all make it into the depot after sacrificing so many people, and Jean realizes that they have no way out and no way to get to any of the refueling canisters, and he just kind of has this moment of absolute despair, which is then shattered as Eren just fucking liquefies two Titan heads in front of him. The choreography of the Attack Titan scenes are just amazing. I love how they use its flexibility and weight to full advantage. Eren is agile, he's constantly moving and fighting like a real fighter, but just at a much higher scale. And because of that much higher scale and strength, the fights are just so punchy and fun. The scene of Armin coming up with the elevator plan to get to the refueling tanks is suitably tense, but I don't know, I just don't like Armin's constant self-doubt at this point. I feel like the series is kind of bending over backwards for his Zero to Hero arc, constantly having him doubt himself over and over and over again. And then going, no, Armin, you're actually the smartest cookie in the entire world. Armin, you're so great. You're so smart. You're the greatest strategic genius I've ever met, Armin. And it's just like, I would rather you show me these things rather than continuously have characters state them. Now, also, again, on the more critical end, there are multiple points during this episode where, due to what I assume are budgetary constraints, there's just kind of a scrolling still image with voiceover. It's not a massive issue, but it does take me out of the episode to some degree. At its worst, in the scene just before the plan is executed, where it's confusingly intercut with actual moving scenes. Another criticism is that I can definitely feel how overly screamy these characters are. The dub problem I mentioned back in episode 1 is becoming increasingly prevalent and annoying. It's not really the VA's fault, I think the performances are really good across the board, it just feels like kind of poor voice direction. The scene of the elevator plan itself being executed is great. Peak Season 1 AOT, with plenty of tension, cool character moments, and just really solid animation and use of space and use of the ODM gear. I love that they make a point to revisit Titans that killed characters previously. It gives this really nice sense of continuity when Titans like the one that killed Mina, Carolina, and Thomas show back up and the characters have their revenge against them. Jumping back to the reveal again, it's hardly unexpected, but the execution is still really commendable. I have a lot of praise for Hiroyuki Sawano for just absolutely full sending it on the score here. Episode 9 is an episode primarily focused around setting up a lot of important pieces, while culminating in one of the best cliffhangers that the series leaves on. At the beginning of the episode, we get the introduction of the Scout Regiment and Captain Levi. Now, this does a couple things. One, it shows us how competent the Scout Regiment can be. how Levi is easily dispatching all of these titans, as are some of the members of his squad. However, once again, there's never this sense of triumph without a sacrifice, as we see a soldier get eaten by a titan. And this becomes a really meaningful scene, which actually establishes Levi's character quite well. All about passing on the torch, as this guy begs Levi to ensure that his death meant something. Also sets up major characters Owen and Hanji really well with some really effective characterization, but we'll get back into those later. Eren's flashback is metal as fuck. He bursts out of the carcass of the titan that ate him after awakening in its stomach, and it's also the combination of this unprepared for war theme. I really love the cut of him reaching his bloodied stump upwards and then his fully healed titan hand erupt out of the titan that ate him. It's just fucking cool, and there's little other description I could put to it than that. This is exactly what sold people on the series. The jump to the present is suitably confusing. I love that it completely puts us in Eren's perspective for a second, as we have no idea why there are all these cannons facing him down and people screaming at him. Now, this is one of my favourite little parts of the season, and another piece of evidence for how strong Attack on Titan's anti-war theming was, even here. This introduces the very, very minor character of Captain Vorman, and you know what, I'll say it, I think Captain Vorman is probably one of the best characters in Season 1, from a functional perspective. He is both completely corrupt and completely incompetent, but that incompetence is rewarded by the situation. No one is willing to question his command when they're faced with the greater threat of a human transforming into a titan. In the middle of this, we cut to Harness talking about how he's sure Eren, Mikasa, and Armin will all be fine, and I get why it's there, but it does sort of break up the immediate tension of the scene, I feel. Eren's first on-purpose transformation is just, again, iconic, both in terms of the seeds it lays, and by the way, I think this is where the Grisha injecting Eren scene from episode 2 would have been much better placed, but also just in terms of its general execution. The flashing lightning, the immaculate motion of the arm forming out of nothing and as muscle and bone like coil around it. It's just, oh, it's so good. Now, episode 10. Now we're getting to the point where I am really confused on how people confuse this series as being pro-war and pro-fascism. Episode 10 is literally all about military incompetence and the mental strain of being a soldier. It's essentially a debate where Armin has to talk Captain Vorman and the rest of the garrison regiment down from blowing Eren up with a giant cannon, and also talk Eren out of just leaving immediately. Now, small side tangent, I really love how the actions of the three Malians here are very multifaceted. You appreciate them so much more knowing the truth. The fact that when there's a mystery titan, they absolutely shit themselves and they're the first ones to fly up to the roof to see what's going on. It's such a good little breadcrumb you don't appreciate until later. Now, going back to the main topic of the episode, Vorman is so desperate to maintain control, he won't let anyone act without his orders, and this desperation to maintain control of the situation is beautifully rendered by his internal monologue. Even when Armin makes genuine salient points about the situation and why Vorman shouldn't shoot, he simply says, well, yeah, but I don't care because I want to maintain control of this situation so that people don't panic. Here we also get a re-establishment of the main goal. Eren realizes that whatever was in Grisha's basement is vitally important to understanding the secrets of the Titans, and it serves as a nice turning point from just Eren want to become member of the Scouts to Eren want to become member of the Scouts because it will allow him to find his dad's basement. Now, as much as I've complained about Armin's character in the past couple of episodes, this is a major turning point for him, and it works really well as that. His speech to the army soldiers is great. It encapsulates so many of the general themes of the series. People in this rigid command structure are broken down mentally by war and the strain of war. Vorman is a really good minor antagonist in this sense. He's someone who has seen the Titans rip through hordes of innocent civilians, and He believes that it is his duty to maintain an iron fist over the army and an iron fist over the situation no matter what. This blind suspicion and a desire to maintain control leads Vormund to attempt to destroy them, even though he himself knows better. This better safe than sorry approach literally sets the entire story of Attack on Titan in motion. The suspicion of those other than yourself and desire to maintain control of your own situation is a central theme of Attack on Titan, a central idea of why the cycle of violence keeps going around and around and around, because someone will always be suspicious of other and want to protect the self. Just on a minor presentation point, this scene is absolutely beautifully scored, and somehow the voice actor manages to make the words "I will advocate for his strategic value" sound like the hardest shit you've ever heard in your entire life, which I completely respect. From there we move on to episode 10, which is the beginning of the culmination of everything that Trost has been about. It starts off really solid, with the military fracturing under the pressure of the order to head back into Trost for Eren to seal up the hole in the wall with the boulder. The soldiers are desperate to do anything they can to survive. Meanwhile, the commanders are willing to shoot anyone and do anything to maintain control over the army. Following on from that, Pixis' speech to Eren about humanity's inability to stop fighting itself lays very interesting seeds for Eren's character later on, where Eren tries to solve racism by removing all of the races except one. What a great guy. The Pixis speech is a really solid piece of writing. He uses the soldiers' desperation in the end to get what he wants, and this isn't done in a particularly malicious way. He says openly, the soldiers can leave if they want. No one would think less of them. Fundamentally, it's coming back to this idea that's introduced with Jean. Empathy, understanding soldiers, not treating them merely as tools of war, treating them as humans who have to make a sacrifice if greater humanity is to be kept safe, but it's understandable that they wouldn't want to make it. I think the major problem with this episode is because it is majorly just talking, scenes do feel quite static, which is very jarring after coming off of the high-paced action with episode 8, 9, and so on. It also does that scrolling to the side thing I was talking about before quite a bit. There's another interlude of an Eren and Mikasa argument where they argue for the 40 billionth time about Eren being angry over Mikasa being protective over him, and she refuses to back down. It's not bad, I understand why this is done, it establishes these characters' relationships to each other, but god do I feel like there was more important shit to focus on this episode. Now, the end of this episode then has like a 5 or 6 minute long monologue from Rico, a minor character in the garrison squad that's protecting Eren while he tries to replace the boulder, that runs on a little too long and does kind of repeatedly ram the themes of the arc in your face a little bit, but it is quite effective. We're supposed to understand that these are real people and they don't want to make this sacrifice, but they have to in order for the greater good, to protect those around them. It doesn't glorify this at all. These people don't want to be here. They're not glorious soldiers immaculately protecting humanity. They're flawed people who have problems and have qualms with trusting someone like Eren, which is completely understandable. And the episode caps off with this absolutely gorgeous piece of animation as Eren slides off the wall and into his Titan form. And yay! Now we get the beginning of the worst episode of the entire season, the one that I was talking about earlier. Episode 12, Wound. Now, it is worth mentioning that a lot of people say this is the weakest stretch of episodes in the entire show, and I don't think that's fair. Episode 10, even though it's mostly talking, is really important in terms of establishing the themes of the series, and it's great that it takes a break from the action to do that. 11, a bit heavy-handed and a bit talking about nothing-y, so I can certainly see why, but still decent enough. Wound, however, is absolutely terrible. Eren's Titans going berserk is an annoying roadblock that adds so little to the story. It makes absolutely no context with the future events of the story either. This happens to literally none of the other shifters. Yes, you go berserk when you're in your base Titan form, but once you've consumed one of the other Titans, you don't just randomly lose control. It's never really explained what this is about. Like, the episode itself tries to kind of venture this. Eren falls into a fantasy and he believes he's at home with his family, but why? Like, it feels more like a thematic decision, attempting to redouble Eren's motivation and bringing the running theme of sacrifice for progress to a head, where Eren has to effectively realize how much he's sacrificed to get to this point. This was already drilled into us many times, way better in previous episodes. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't like awful. It's still about a 4-5 out of 10 episode. There are a few decent moments, but so much of this episode feels half-baked. From Eren's illusion of a life at home to the potential mutiny of the elite squad, nothing feels like it actually has any weight or meaning. And I think the reason for this episode taking a break from having Eren do anything is to characterize the elite squad. And the reason for this is that the elite squad dying is kind of capping off that theme of sacrifice. None of these people wanted to be here, but they are all eventually convinced to sacrifice themselves for Eren. Could this have been done much better mechanically? Absolutely. And I think episode 12 is definitely one that suffers from the anime stretching it out. Because in the manga, this series of events takes very little time, we get very little characterization for the elite squad, and so when they die, it's a lot more. Whereas Wound taking the time to characterize the elite squad works out great. And I think they actually made the best of a bad plot point by doing that, because it does make the ensuing events where most of the elite squad die a lot better. Even despite that though, this episode is just so it very much feels like a waste of time. Like, you could completely skip from 11 to 13 and not miss anything of value. Not that I would particularly advocate for that, but just, yeah, I really hate this episode on so many levels. However, I will say that Eren's "The land beyond the wall is my birthright" line, which ends up burning his idyllic home life away, is such a cool character moment in so many ways for showing who he is. Eren is all about his ambition, all about wanting to see beyond the wall. And this is central to understanding his character and how... this is central to understanding his character later on. It juxtaposes really well with Armin, because Armin's goal is to see the world outside the walls for nothing more than genuine curiosity. He loves knowledge, and he wants to know more about the world outside the wall to increase his knowledge. And that's a completely fine thing. However, Eren sees the world beyond the wall as his property, the property of the people within the walls, and they deserve it. And it is their right to take it away from the Titans or whatever other enemy might be out there. And this is something that gets twisted and turned around and turned on its head when Eren takes his heel turn in Season 4. The final episode of Trost, Primal Desire, is an episode we goddamn deserved after struggling through Wound, an almost perfect culmination of the ideas of the arc. Before getting to the meat, the side plot with the cadets is decent, mostly interesting in how it advances Jean, and I can see watching weekly how he looked absolutely cooked here. Now, the central hype piece of Eren lifting the boulder is immaculate, from the animation of the Titan as this hulking, powerful form, with the face and eyes obscured, literally becoming an icon of defiance. Eren is putting the restoration of humanity on his back like Atlas. Oh, that's such a cool, just visual image. The final battle is also really nice as well. It forces the troops into a position of immense risk, and we see almost everyone die as a result. It also completes Rico's character, who, as the most reluctant member of the elite squad, is the last one left to save Eren when he needs it, and she makes that decision. I love how we see Eren initially as he's striding along as this icon, like I mentioned before, carrying the hopes of humanity on his back. But then when he sees his friends running along the ground, we see this really human shot of his face and his eye when he worries for his friends. It's a neat bit of visual storytelling, and again tells us a lot about how Eren views the world. This segment sums up the first major theme in this arc, the importance of defiance in the face of adversity, no matter where that adversity comes from. But after this big hype piece, they make sure to snap back to reality, showing the human cost of the operation. War is never truly without cost, even if it is just. A second major theme of Trost. We always have to empathize and understand. War is not something good. War is never something justified. War is a last resort in which people have to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of those they need to protect. Now, the death of Marco is fine for me. I know this was kind of a big touchstone for early Attack on Titan fans, but even at the time, I don't think Marco was enough of a character to really make me go, oh shit, he's dead! It is really good for how it changes Jean, though. I love the small moments with the Marleyans in episode 13. This is some really good hindsight setup, especially showing Annie crying in regret over Marco's death. And finally, we cap off by introducing the scouts and Eren's next challenge. He's incarcerated and about to be put on trial. Trost is a really weird arc to talk about. There are a lot more ups than I remember, but just as many downs as I remember. And with what people generally seem to consider to be the weakest 3-episode stretch in the series, 10, 11, 12, but also high highs like 13. Trost is in large part a setup arc. As much as the melodrama feels important at the time, from a grand perspective it is very much setting the stage for AOT's more interesting mysteries, like the basement and the possibility of human Titan shifters. It does have its own themes as an arc though, as I've repeatedly iterated, particularly about the nature of sacrifice for progress, how the Garrison Elite Squad sacrifice themselves for Eren's success while not wanting to, and how important that sacrifice is, but it's also the most focused of the early arcs on the nature of war, with what incompetent dictatorial leadership causes in times of war. This is the arc that instantly disproves the reading of AOT is some sort of story glorifying fascism. Pixis rallies the troops by standing in defiance of a rigid command structure and controlling through fear. He instead attempts to inspire his troops by showing them empathy. There is just no alternative other than to fight in this scenario. There's also some philosophizing about the nature of the cruelty of the world, and beginning to talk about the cycle of violence, mostly about how to live is to resist and fight against that cruelty despite being powerless to stop it. Understandable why this is a sticking point for some people though. After the bombastic final episode of the Trost arc, and a little bit of cooling off with mourning the death of Marco, the series switches gears to exploring this world and how human society actually works within the walls. And it does this in a pretty natural and engaging way. Eren is an unknown element as far as the military within the walls is concerned. A trial was an obvious next step for a suspicious government to make. It also allows the show to explore much broader concepts about law and order, and also demonstrate the class divide between the layers of the wall. To begin with, this episode introduces us to a lot of new characters. It gives us our first proper introduction to Freaky Hanji. It gives us the commander of the military police, Nile Doc, who has a strong desire to keep order in the interior and prevent a rebellion from occurring in Eren's name. And then you have the laid-back attitude of Premier Zachary. I always do love a good trial. They're always interesting to me because they put a really heavy emphasis on the ability to write dialogue and write the psychology of the people in the room. Now, as I said before, because this involves the various factions and the various layers of the wall, it lends more background and depth to certain areas. Like, we get more expansion on the Wall Cult, who are a group of insane wall-worshipping zealots who believe that the walls were put there by God and we shouldn't touch them, and they've grown significantly more powerful in the years since the Colossal Titan's initial attack. As well as that, we get more background into the actual ideological differences between the MPs and the Scouts. The Scouts believe that any risk is worth taking so long as it brings humanity closer to its eventual goals, whereas the MPs just want to maintain the basic level of law and order within the walls. It's also great that lots of small facts about these characters that didn't really need to be brought back up are actually brought into play in the trial. Like, it's actually mentioned that Mikasa and Eren killed those kidnappers in Mikasa's backstory, and I think that's a really cool link, and it makes sense how the MPs would be able to dig that dirt up and justify their characterization of Eren as being bat-fucking sane using that. This trial is, for me, excellent. It builds and builds in intensity, with the Scouts being stymied at every turn with random shit that the military police can bring up, and the fact that the merchants and the wall cultists absolutely reject anything that might threaten their own power and cause risk. We get this constant building of tension as there's this ideological battle between Eren and the Scouts, who want to use Eren's power at any cost to fight for the people of the wall and to expand their territory outside the wall, believing that Eren might be their first true advantage against the Titans. And then just as this emotional fervor hits its peak, Levi's actions snap you into cold hard logic. It puts you into the mental state of the characters in the room very well, I think, because you're not really expecting Levi to just come out and do this and start wailing on Eren, but he just does it. Overall, the trial episode is really, really strong in my opinion. It's a natural way to expand on the world building of the people within the wall, and doesn't feel particularly ham-fisted like other attempts at world building have felt in like episode 3 for example. The following episode is again little bits of more interesting world building and character building. It is less engaging this time because it doesn't have the same interesting framing device of the trial, but essentially it wants to establish the characters of the Levi squad and does this pretty well for the most part. But it does leave the most interesting part of their characterization, their whole internal conflict between being immediately mistrustful of Eren because he's a Titan shifter and wanting to believe in him because they like him as a person. This is left out until much later, which I find a little frustrating. The episode didn't have to do everything that happened later on in the little cut, where we cut back to this same period, but it would have been nice to at least see a few more of those elements coming into play here, rather than having them just kind of slammed in at the end. It focuses also a lot on the Titans. We'll learn a lot about their physiology in a pretty natural way through Hanji, who gives Eren a whole monologue and speech about her scientific observations of them, and it also helps us explore her character. Hanji is presented interestingly to us at the beginning. She firmly believes that scientific research and scientific advancement is the way to beat the Titans. Knowledge at any cost is worth it, she believes. This is an attitude that the show will play around with a lot going on. We end off on even further intrigue. Hanji's Titans are killed, and it's used to cast suspicion within the army itself. Irvin's line is fantastic here. It beautifully sets up the fact that we're meant to distrust everyone, and sets up the idea of there being a Titan shifter within the army without overtly saying anything. The following and final episode of this mini-arc sets up the state of the supporting cast: Jean, Annie, Armin, and the rest. Jean's development is really nice. It's quick, but it feels natural given what he saw at Trost. He becomes way more of an actual leader, taking the responsibility on himself and going, I might want to join the military police with everything I have, but it's the right thing to join the Scouts. There's a lot of very subtle foreshadowing handled with Annie, where we can actually see Armin glancing confused at her ODM gear because he recognizes that it's Marco's. The selecting regiment scene is what really makes this episode for me though. The visual choice to isolate our main characters amongst a horde of faceless people leaving as they desperately try and stand firm and question why they're even doing what they're doing. The building music, Owen's speech, which again echoes Pixis's whole thing of showing empathy in the face of soldiers that have to give their lives, saying, yeah, effectively we have a 0.01 chance of succeeding, but we need to do what we do in order for humanity to survive. It's fucking peak Attack on Titan, honestly. This might be one of the best single scenes in the show for so many reasons. After this, we place a bit more focus on the actual strategy of Erwin's plans. He is going to take Eren out on a wall recovery operation to prove Eren's usefulness, and we focus a lot on how his battlefield formation works. This is very good because logistics is incredibly important to the next upcoming arc of Attack on Titan, because understanding the logistics and geography of the situation in the coming arc adds so much to the tension, rather than having it explained haphazardly in the actual episodes themselves. The final scene with Jean is so good. It represents the mental state of these characters beautifully, as they've effectively gone through hell, all of them have PTSD, and all they want to do is find some way of getting back at the Titans. I'd forgotten Jean was such an interesting character, even this early on in the show. Overall, it's not that much to talk about, it's just an incredibly solid build-up arc. It introduces us to a lot of the key concepts that are going to become important going forward in Attack on Titan, like the politics within the walls, the biology and the mystery of how the Titans work, the important characters in the Scout Regiment. And it just feels much more natural at doing this than the training camp arc, which had a lot of elements that didn't quite gel together properly. I'm going to take another small break to talk about my second major criticism of early Attack on Titan. It's appeared a little bit so far, but I do think it becomes much more prevalent in this next arc, which is a little bit annoying because this is the best part of Attack on Titan Season 1. Now, the problem here is the flow of information to the viewer and the flow tonally. Multiple scenes where important moments are interrupted by long flashbacks to the past to show things I feel could have been shown before. There's a lot of space in these early setup episodes, and yeah, not necessarily in the episodes about the trial or about everyone selecting their regiment, but definitely in the episode that's supposed to be introducing the scouts, there was time to talk about their suspicion of Eren and introduce that element more naturally. As it is, it kind of just doesn't come into the story until the flashback. And yeah, that's not the most major criticism, but spending 10 minutes cutting out of a significantly tense moment to give time for something we could have set up more naturally before, it just feels like kind of bad structuring to me. Flow is important because it helps magnify those strong emotional moments Attack on Titan relies on so heavily. Remember I was talking about before, the constant build-up and build-up and build-up of tension until eventual release, to me is just kind of cut off when they decide to cut back to a month prior and talk about Eren's relationship to the rest of the people in the Scout Squad. And I do feel like it cheapens their death somewhat, having the whole kind of trope of cutting back to talk about why we should care about these people, rather than making it much more natural for us to care about these people beforehand. But anyway, as I said, not the most major criticism, and something I think Attack on Titan will do a lot better with than the character economy point that I was making before, but something to keep in mind as one of my only real criticisms of this part. The female Titan arc is definitely my favourite arc of Season 1, and has some strong contenders for the best episode of the season. I love how in the beginning it places some focus on the efficiency of Owen's tactics. They're able to overcome Titan advantages through clever tactics and a rigorous system of communication. Owen knows that one of the main advantages the Titans are able to create is that their appearance creates paranoia and panic, so he ensures strong communication between his ranks to prevent a single Titan's appearance from overwhelming the entire formation. It's also important to note that he doesn't place his soldiers in any form of undue risk. He doesn't actively charge the formation into Titans whenever he feels like it, and generally tends to avoid them whenever they're spotted. Episode 17 is all about establishing these tactics, as well as their efficiency, but also how dangerous Titans can be beyond the walls, how the landscape is unpredictable and unknown, how trees can mass Titans that jump out from behind them and bite you in half. And there's also this horror of the abnormals. They can't be dealt with like normal Titans since they don't focus on the humans that you want them to focus on. They simply jump and run towards wherever they've decided to run. Typical tactics are quite ineffective against them. And that's an interesting way of kind of building on the horror in zombie movies of like the evolved zombie, the zombie that doesn't follow the typical zombie tactics, that might start running at you or isn't easily distracted. But building on from that even, the female Titan is such an insanely well-established threat. And episode 17 taking the time to actually show us how effective the formation is and how good it is at dealing with Titans, and how the scouts aren't chumps. They're capable of dealing with times when the formation is almost about to fail them, but Annie just completely obliterates the formation and is able to strategically decimate it. Episode 17 has an absolutely bone-chilling scene where the female Titan catches Armen and lifts up his hood, and this is absolutely amazing because of the lack of melodrama. The music practically cuts out, and we just have this moment of silence as Armen stares up in horror as this giant, ruthless creature slowly bends down and gently picks off his hood, without even leaving like a scratch on him. It's so effective because we've had it reinforced so many times how these Titans are defined by brutal, crushing force and nothing else, but this one has intelligence and dexterity, and even seems to be discerning. Now, there's a lot of small details to this episode building up to the eventual betrayal of Reiner. And I think they're really effective. Like, for example, when Annie initially attacks the scout regiment, she attacks the flank that Reiner believes that Eren was in. And then when she meets up with Armen and Reiner, when Reiner gets caught, we actually get to see the glance at her palm when Reiner breaks out, and then running in a completely different direction, which is now where Reiner knows Eren is after being told by Armen. It's very, very small stuff, but it's great that the show actually starts hinting at it and building onto the mystery in a natural way, instead of sort of the Reiner and Berthold betrayal being revealed at the end with absolutely no build-up to it, because it makes scenes like this hit so much harder on a rewatch, and I really appreciate that. On to the more negative side of things, though, we do get back to every character having to reaffirm that Armen is in fact smart. I feel like I'm going to start liking this character a hell of a lot more when people just stop doing this and the show just lets him be smart. Episode 18 continues on from episode 17 with just constant focus on the tension, as Annie gets inexorably closer and closer to Eren's position, and we see her brutally dispatch entire squads of scouts. Like the scene where she fights a group of scouts in this kind of small village with a windmill, and there's some amazing animation here which beautifully shows the maneuverability of the ODM gear, but then she just like bucking grabs them and starts twizzling them around like toys. Not only is she intelligent and dexterous, but she's also incredibly cruel. And this is a weird thing to me, because this arc attempts to make Annie incredibly cruel and deliberately malicious. Now, yes, all of the other Titans take actions that cause mass death and are horrific. However, when they do it, it's with a mentality of, these are the things that we've got to do, essentially. They don't do it out of cruelty, if that makes sense. Whereas, Annie's actions here read more as genuine malice, where she doesn't just, like, kill soldiers efficiently, she actively goes out of their way to toy with them. And that's something that's never really dealt with more in her psychology, and this kind of cruel, sadistic aspect to her character will get explained a bit more in the climax of the show at Stohess, but they never really get answered, and I'm not sure that Isayama should have ever really tried to redeem this character, especially because her sadistic streak is never really expanded upon. Again, I love the focus on the geography and its consequences for the mission, like they realize they're about to run into this giant forest, and Irvin does it deliberately because he wants to force the female titan into a narrow alleyway and force her into a trap. However, obviously the characters are going to question this. It completely ruins their visibility, and they aren't going to be able to see any titans coming. Jean is a great character for this because he questions orders. He won't risk his life unless he has to, and has no problem questioning authority, even if he won't openly contradict them with his actions. And I think that just makes him a really interesting character. Jean's whole thing is understanding things empathetically and from the human perspective. Oftentimes, he's a coward, and that grounds the show because he's a coward in the face of things it's completely valid to be a coward against. Meanwhile, Eren's just like full suicidal charge. However, this arc does actually humanize Eren quite a bit, as we begin to balance the grander plot of Irvin's strategy with the human toll that this is taking, as Irvin sacrifices the entire rearguard to Annie's advance just so he can get her into the trap. And the Levi squad even begin to doubt his competency, with Levi himself not really knowing what's going on. I like how Eren's naivety is shown here as well. He's very obviously just this kid who has no idea what he's doing in an actual combat situation and rapidly begins to lose his shit. Also, compared to Trost, this arc places a much greater focus on the actual psychology of the characters at play. Levi has to use an acoustic round to stop the members of the Levi squad from completely panicking, and it works. It makes them all remember the fact that they have to accept sacrifice in order to continue. It doesn't work on Eren though, because he's so grandly unprepared for everything that he's doing. Despite his big talk, he is fundamentally naive and unwilling to make sacrifice here. Now, I do think I was initially a little harsh on the flashback on first viewing. My point about flow does still stand. It is weird where this plays, but I get why they did it. It's important context for Eren's decision during this arc, and does include important characterization for the Levi squad trusting him. And it also has smaller stuff, like Hanji's "science is always worth the risk" line, which is central to her character, and Levi going out of his way to protect Eren from his own squad. I don't think it's perfect, and it goes on a little too long to the point where it could have just been attached to the episode actually introducing these characters, but I don't mind it as much as I did on first viewing. It's a very well put together flashback. Eren's choice here is really important for his character. Twice during this arc, he's forced to choose between his standing with his squad or taking everything on by himself. Here, he's proved right, and in the second instance, he's proved wrong. This is core to understanding why Eren makes the decision-making he makes later on. He comes to view the idea of relying and trusting in others to help you as weakness. He fundamentally misunderstands Levi's point about there being no right answer, and applies this to basically any situation he's put in. The end of episode 19 is absolutely beautiful. All of this mounting uncertainty is dropped into a big surprising success. As we cut between two conversations assessing the morality of Irvin's actions. They're effective, but incredibly costly in terms of how many scouts had to die just for this to happen. I actually like the subtlety of how Levi's attempt to intimidate Annie goes completely wrong, and he ends up spooking her into using her last resort when she thought she could still escape. He was more used to dealing with regular titans that don't respond to intimidation because they don't have consciousness. Episode 20 is much more of a standing around talking episode, but it's an important bridge from the high everyone felt after the female titan was captured to the abject despair when she escapes and begins to pick off the Levi squad. And I love how it's not made immediately obvious that Annie escaped, so for a second it's just kind of this Pyrrhic victory where the scout squad won in the end, but you know, at what cost? But then you get the cliffhanger of the cloaked figure rapidly approaching Levi's squad, and that is just, I would have died if I was watching this weekly at the time. And this is where the Levi squad start to drop. Now, the Levi squad for me are a bit like Marco. They're not the most engaging characters by themselves, even though I know they're a fan favorite to some. personally, I just don't feel that much for them, but they are really interesting in terms of how they affect Eren's psychology. So, in the beginning, when Eren first loses his mum, this sparks a big inferiority complex inside him. And he feels like he was weak, like he was unable to protect her, like it was all his fault. And this becomes central to his anger at the Titans. He wants to take back control forcefully over them and wipe them all out, just to prove that he is capable of actually taking control. Now here, where he actually begins to make a bit of a positive change in trusting people, he makes the wrong decision. And it's important to remember that he could not have known anything that was going to happen. This was just a decision that went poorly. But to Eren, this was again him fundamentally failing to take control at the right time. And this is where Eren starts to really harden as a character. He begins to get this sense of having failed everyone around him. But anyway, getting back to what's actually happening for a second, the attack made by the Levi squad on the female Titan is really obviously beautifully animated, like God, the female Titan arc steps up the animation quality, but there's also these small details that really shine through, like Eld's hand signals, signaling all of the different members of the squad into position without even having to talk. It's a really fun way to present an elite squad and show their difference to the rest of the fighters we've seen so far in Attack on Titan. The ensuing flesh mecha fight as Eren turns back around on the female Titan and starts to absolutely fucking wail on her is really, really good. It shows Eren as essentially just being this wild force that jumps around and leaps and just keeps wailing on her, using his arms primarily as weapons instead of using any form of, like, martial art, whereas Annie is cool, calm, and for the most part collected. In particular, that shot of Eren sat on top of Annie just tweaking out, thinking about how he's gonna kill it, is just terrifying. It again shows Eren ain't quite right in the head, right from the very beginning. And it's something that, for the first time, brings actual terror to Annie, and she's only able to defeat him once she takes the time to calm down, get her distance, and strike Eren in a moment of weakness. Levi then finding all of the dead squad members, but pressing on anyway, is absolutely brutal, and it's core to who he is. Levi is someone who deliberately takes on the sacrifice of every scout who dies, and redoubles his intention to wipe the Titans out no matter what the cost. And then it's effectively just going from stellar animation to stellar animation, as we have Mikasa versus Annie as she makes desperate strikes trying to retrieve Eren, doing all she can, but she's unable to, and then Levi and her team up in order to finally take her down. The final episode of the arc is really effective at humanizing the lost soldiers, as Irvin forbids them for going back for certain bodies to give them a proper burial. Certain soldiers decide to mutiny and retrieve the bodies themselves, which causes the scout squad's retreating formation to be chased after by a bunch of Titans. The melodrama here is put to such better use than in Trost, as the characters are forced to reckon with the fact that they have to abandon elements of their basic human decency in order to strike wins against the Titans, or even just to survive. But key to this is that the characters never forget their empathy. Levi, even though he can't retrieve the bodies of the dead scouts, brings back their badges and gives the badges to their fallen comrades, and I think that's a really important detail in understanding the psychology of these characters. They're not viewing death as this kind of glorious end. They understand how painful death can be, how shit war is, but there are certain realities to that can't be gotten rid of. This arc sold me on Attack on Titan Season 1 for many reasons. The animation was absolutely impeccable, and this was a beautiful continuation of Season 1's theme of victory through sacrifice. How despite all of the sacrifices that were made during this arc, that doesn't always mean you win. It's avoiding the trap of sort of trying to over-glorify victory through sacrifice and Pyrrhic victories, because it shows that sacrificing a lot and making yourself monstrous in order to achieve your goals doesn't automatically mean that you achieve them. It also builds on really important characters within the Scouts like Evan and Levi really nicely, as well as Eren. Even if the only minor criticism I do have is that it makes Annie quite difficult to sympathize with later on. As I said, you get shown this very sadistic streak to her, and that's never really built on or shown within any of the other Mali. And she's never really forced to reckon with that at all. She's just kind of treated like all of the other Malians were during the war. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely an emotional aspect to her character even being introduced here with how she's shown crying after losing Eren. But that just makes the sadistic elements to her character feel even more out of place for me here. Like, it's a really cool scene, but once you characterize a character as being that cold, calculating, and cruel, you can't just then go back and not really expand on it any further. Stohess is the final arc of Attack on Titan, and it begins by giving a bit of extra context on how corrupt and indolent the military police have become, and the inequality between those on the interior and exterior. Those on the interior get everything they can ever want, they're essentially just rich merchant folk, and those on the exterior are forced to struggle for any scraps of food they can get. With us being reminded of the fact that hundreds of thousands of people from the exterior were exiled just to make more room for these people to live their lavish lifestyle. It's nice to give more context to the MPs. It makes them feel more like a fleshed out group rather than just a bunch of annoying guys who don't like Eren. There are good people within the MPs, it's just a fundamentally corrupt organization. Marlowe is a really cool minor character. He's a mirror to Eren in a lot of ways, someone with a lot of ambition to make grand changes to the injustices he sees in the world, but unlike Eren, he fundamentally doesn't have what it takes to enact violence in order to achieve that goal, and this isn't presented as a bad thing. Marlowe in the moment hates himself, but this self-hatred is what leads Marlowe to make reckless decisions that lead to his death in the end. Going back to this again, because it becomes even clearer during the Stohess arc for me, I find Annie's characterization just really weird. It flip-flops all over the place between tragic character and remorseless villain, and I feel like Isayama was able to build a lot better on how he actually wanted to deal with the Malians with Reiner and Bertolt, whose actions are a lot more consistent. When Reiner and Bertolt do something, it doesn't feel like it's done out of sheer, cold, sadistic cruelty, it's done out of necessity. That doesn't make the action any better, but it does make their characters a lot easier to reconcile with as being fundamentally tragic, whereas Annie goes out of her way to torment members of the Scout Squad, and acts sometimes as a completely remorseless person. And that's okay, but I just feel like it's not adequately built on. The final scene of episode 23 is very solid outside of this though. I love how there's mounting tension towards the reveal as Eren, Armin, and Mikasa try and beg Annie to go into the underground crawl space with them, as they don't want to believe that she's a Titan. Now, in episode 24, I originally kind of hated the fact that Eren was unable to turn into a Titan to fight Annie, because it just felt like a bit of an annoying rehash of how episode 12 Wound kind of blue-balled us before the eventual end of the Trost arc. But it does make sense to me now. Eren was always someone who was extremely sentimental over those he trained with and those he knows personally, and it gives the show extra time to show this, because he's completely incapable of consoling the fact that Annie, someone he knew, could have betrayed him. And this shows one of the other core aspects of Eren's character, which is how much he values those in his immediate circle, and how he's completely unwilling to sacrifice them, and how his eventual actions are, in part, because of his constant desire for freedom and control, and also in part because he wants to make a world where he can protect those in his immediate circle. Season 1, at least to me here, makes the most clear thematic setup for Season 4. This is the real start of Eren learning to A, take everything on his own, and B, become completely heartless in order to achieve his goals. The show keeps reiterating this mentality of, in order to defeat the monsters, we must become monsters ourselves kind of mentality. But the key point is that where earlier this was tempered by empathy, with Levi having to throw away the bodies on the cart, but he still retrieves the badges of the fallen scouts anyway, here, it's not tempered by anything. Eren doesn't take that part of the lesson on. All he takes on is the desire to do anything at any cost, and slowly forgets his sense of empathy throughout the show. Niall's conversation with Erwin is actually fascinating though. Not only how far Erwin is willing to go to demonstrate the Titan threat to the interior, even so far as letting himself die, it also proves that he doesn't see himself as unique. He's fully disposable in his own plans from the offset, and he's ready to be killed so long as someone carries on the mission. And I think that's really, really important to understanding the scouts. There is no sort of hierarchy where no one is above reproach, where no one is above being sacrificed. They make the sacrifices they have to, because they need to achieve their goals. The Annie versus Eren fight is absolutely sick, and I think the non-canon Burning Titan transformation is absolutely perfect for Eren, even though it does kind of make no sense. I also love how this fight humanizes Annie. Her first instinct when Eren appears is to go, oh shit, and run away towards the wall, and she's struck by constant flashbacks to her father. We aren't being encouraged to see her as some cold-hearted enemy to be slain here. She's actually kind of pathetic as she makes her desperate scrabbles to try and stop Eren. This is supposed to be a tragic moment, which would work a hell of a lot better if we hadn't set her up consistently as this kind of emotionless killer willing to play with the lives of those around her. The season is tied together with a really poignant note from Jean. If it's that easy for the fight to turn us all into monsters, do we really deserve to win? Now this is key to understanding Attack on Titan. As I was talking about before, that constant duality between making the sacrifices you need to win and empathy, and fundamentally retaining your humanity. This is where the series ratchets itself back from going, glorious sacrifice, we will become monsters in order to destroy the enemy, and shows the fact that it's very self-aware of the idea that making great sacrifice must not be done while dehumanizing the sacrifices made. And finally, we get that ending sting, with the wall falling away to reveal the face of the Titan. And that's it. That's where Attack on Titan ends. September the 29th, 2013. And then the long wait begins. Attack on Titan is a really interesting show to me personally, as my feelings on it have really flip-flopped around a lot, especially after rewatching this season. I was originally not the hugest fan while watching Season 1 back in like 2016. Then, when Season 2, 3 Part 1 and 3 Part 2 came out, I was absolutely on the Attack on Titan train, and then, for multiple reasons, very much fell off during Season 4, and started to not appreciate it as much. With Season 1 specifically, I always used to think it was a bit shit. Partially because my teenage sludge brain couldn't comprehend when it was actually doing something clever, but also because there are a lot of problems within it that make it easy to dismiss a lot of what Attack on Titan is actually doing on the cleverer end. Don't get me wrong, this season is not a masterpiece. It's just a season of a show I think is genuinely misunderstood and underappreciated for what it does. It makes sense why a lot of people hate the ending of Season 4, when those same people will mostly just straight up skip Season 1 or just kinda not really pay attention to it. Which is very easy to do because a lot of the most interesting world building and character concepts don't start to come into it until Season 2. I was actually part of this camp initially. I didn't rewatch Season 1 at all when I was rewatching the show. However, Season 1 is an important keystone for understanding the entirety of Attack on Titan. Its themes are all about victory through sacrifice and the true cost and ethics of being a soldier, which are very well expressed. Now, obviously, it doesn't bring bring individual characters full circle, so I won't talk about them too much here, but I would just like to talk about the themes of Season 1. Season 1 is fundamentally a critique of the military, how fascist governments often create this mythological idea of a grand death through sacrifice, how sacrificing your life makes it all worth it to the greater cause. And Attack on Titan has elements of this, how they're all dying to desperately stop the Titans from destroying the last fragments of humanity. But fundamentally, these deaths are never portrayed as glorious. Having guts in the face of death doesn't make your death any less grisly or any less tragic. The show takes constant effort to remind us of the human cost of these actions, both through showing every death in its full grisly display, and through showing the knock-on effects that those deaths have, like when the families of the Levi squad members are shown after their deaths, how they're all expecting them to come home. Essentially, the show is saying that there is no glorious death through sacrifice. The only way to make sacrifice meaningful is by remembering the people who made the sacrifice and honoring it fundamentally. It also has a lot of minor criticisms about military efficacy and class, where the military forms rigid, strict control systems to keep information, to keep officers in control, and to keep the soldiery sufficiently beaten down. And Attack on Titan repeatedly shows us that that is the wrong attitude, that all that leads to is paranoia and hatred within people, and unnecessary death. In terms of the main cast, I think Eren and Armin haven't really had their time to shine. They get strong arcs throughout the course of the season, don't get me wrong. Eren slowly begins to harden himself, and this point about sacrifice with empathy is something Eren fundamentally does not understand. All Eren wants is to take control over everything around him, to give himself ultimate freedom and get freedom for those around him. We'll go much deeper in depth into Eren's character in later parts of the retrospective. I don't want to get way too ahead of myself. Meanwhile, I'd really underappreciated how well this series introduces Mikasa and Jean. A lot of the elements that make Mikasa and Jean meaningful characters are introduced here, and I actually became a bit of a Mikasa fan retroactively when I didn't really like her character before. I thought she was heavily underutilized, and I do think that will become a recurring criticism of later seasons for me, that after Eren makes his return in the Trost arc, Mikasa doesn't really get to do all that much as a character. She's very much shelved until her final pieces of development towards the end of Season 4, and that is a massive shame, but we'll see if I'm accurate with that. Jean in general is just a fantastic character. I went from thinking that really he maybe shouldn't still be hanging around to see in Season 4, to understanding absolutely why he's been here the whole length of the show, and why he deserved to be one of the two characters we see in the ending. Now, overall, it's an 8 out of 10 for me. A really solid season with some admitted low points. After this, we get the 4-year-long wait. And this, I think, was the single most damaging thing for Attack on Titan's legacy.